Hi everyone, and welcome to this session titled Which Charity Should You Give to with Michael Townsend. I'm Jia Yi and I'll be the MC for this session. Following Michael's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the shortcut live discussion feature. Then after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. But now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Michael is a researcher at Giving What We Can with an academic background in philosophy and law. He is also an actively engaged member of the Effective Altruism community as an organizer for his university society and core organizer for EAGx Australia 2019 and 2022. He has previously volunteered as a researcher investigating policy around global catastrophic risk for Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and has experience as a journalist, consultant, and a professional poker player. On to you, Michael.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here. So my name is Michael. I'm a researcher at Giving What We Can, and today I'm here to talk about charitable giving. And this is going to be a talk that will go through the why and where to give, regardless of your values and your experience with effective giving so far. The talk will start at a more introductory level, and we'll go into more detail as the talk goes on. That's where we can get to most of the weeds in the Q&A, where we can really dive into the details if people would like. And in this talk, I'm going to give a sneak preview on a lot of the new research we've done at Giving What We Can, based on our investigations into several charitable giving experts. We'll share our recommendations, and we'll also make an announcement of a new way to give at the end of the talk, our cause area funds. So to start things off, I think it's important when we're thinking about giving to remember some context that maybe not all of us know. I think it's really important to keep in mind as we're listening to how we could potentially be having an impact with our donations. And I want to make this, provide this context using this soccer or football analogy, depending on where you are. So 22 people on a football field, let's ask them to leave and replace them with 100 adults from around the world that are perfectly representative of our global population. So different countries, different languages, heights, weights, different financial positions, everything across the board. Okay, and now let's ask them to line up from goal to goal, from the people who have the highest annual income to the people who have the lowest annual income. And if you're thinking, well, everyone makes money from a different currency and money goes further depending on where you live, so it's not apples to apples, then you're right. Let's make that adjustment. So we're making this apples to apples by adjusting for the cost of living where people live. Now I want everyone to take a moment and pause and think about where they might be if they were on this field. And I want you to hold that thought, and I want you to think of a different person, a Chilean farmer who makes 1 million Chilean pesos after taxes annually. So converted to USD, that's only $1,300 to live on. But things are so much cheaper in Chile, we're going to need to multiply that salary by the World Bank's purchasing power parity coefficient for Chile before we compare it to something like a US salary, before we can make it into apples to apples comparisons. That gives us a post-tax income of about $3,000. And then I've taken the post-tax salary and converted it to a pre-tax using the 2022 tax rates from New York City, which is just a bit of an arbitrary choice, as a version of this talk is often given in New York City. And then I want you to have a think about where you sit and also then where that Chilean farmer sits. If you said the top 50% for the Chilean farmer, then you're right, because you only need to make $3,769 to actually be in that top 50%. So our Chilean farmer is circled there, and they are earning more money than most adults on Earth. And again, this is after already giving everyone in developing countries where goods are cheaper a huge raise with the World Bank's purchasing power parity index. To be in the top 15%, you need to earn much more at just under $20,000. To be in the top 5%, that's $40,000 per year pre-tax. And if you wanted to take a guess at the top 1%, do so now, it's about $90,000 in internationalized dollars. But let's be honest, we know that there are people who are a lot richer than this. And so let's think about what it means to be in that top 1%. What's that typical person in that top 1%? So take a guess now if you'd like. You need to be making just under $120,000 per year to be the representative person in that top 1%. And of course, the income disparity only becomes greater when we move everyone down and show the full distribution. This is what global income distribution looks like. So I think many people, and likely most of us here, are not just slightly better off, but way better off than most people. You might be first, second in line. And even if you're a student on a modest income, you might find yourself in the top half. And that gives you an excellent opportunity. It's easy to think that we're powerless, but looking at it this way, we may be in a greater position to influence the world than we'd otherwise think. And I want you to hold that in mind, that potential power and influence you might have when we're talking about charity and about how much good we can do through charity. So the first example I want to give about charity, which some of you might have heard before, is play pumps. This was an international charity founded in 1994 by this guy, Trevor Field. He had an ingenious idea for helping rural villages get access to clean water. The idea was to replace traditional water pumps with a playground merry-go-round that kids could spin and play on. As the kids played on the merry-go-round, the force from the water would pump the water upwards into an elevated storage tank where clean water could be stored. Even better, the sides of that elevated storage tank could become billboards, and then the advertising revenue could cover the costs of any repair that was needed. Oh, yes?
Your screen share has stopped. Could you start again?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Okay, how is it now?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we were at the merry-go-round and the billboard that was pumping the water. So you might be thinking this is a great idea. And if you are not the only one. In 2000, Play Pumps won the World Bank Developmental Marketplace Award. And in 2005, Frontline made a documentary about the program. There were many successes, including Jay-Z becoming a major donor along with Beyonce. Some of you might know the story and know, or some of you might be thinking that this is just too good to be true. And you'd be right. Unfortunately, it's not a good idea. As documented in a 2009 report by UNICEF, their pumps, the pumps were super inefficient, expensive to install, and constantly breaking down. Worse still, the children got tired of them, and it was often left to the older women of the village to turn the merry-go-round around, which they found quite demeaning and humiliating. So because water was first pumped upwards into the short storage tank, getting one drop of water required 5 minutes of pumping. And lastly, no one bought the advertising space on the tanks, and thus there were no revenue to repair them when they broke, which sometimes left the villages with no means to pump water. So despite all the awards, the documentaries, the tens of millions in funding, Play Pumps hurt the people it sought to help. And worse still, it continued to run for years after this report came out. So what's the takeaway? Well, for one, as good as any good investor knows, good stories don't equate to good results. But I think that there's something revealing here. There's something that this reveals that's even bigger, even more important, which is that unlike traditional marketplaces, charitable marketplaces don't have a closed value loop. In traditional marketplaces, the person giving the money is also typically the one receiving the value. If we don't get the anticipated value, we can get a refund, a return, or just not support that business in the future. This is why bad businesses often go out of business. Charitable marketplaces don't have a closed value loop. When you give your money to the charity, the value goes somewhere else, likely to someone you don't know or who you'll never meet, which means ineffective charities can stay in business and actually thrive. So how do they do this? The same way bad businesses do. They thrive on the strength of their marketing and fundraising. That's the value loop in the charitable marketplace. Money in exchange for marketing goods and good marketing and good feelings. When you think about this and the ineffective charities that stay in business, it can be easy to get jaded on charitable giving. But here's the issue with that. The world is facing some huge problems, and there are lots of ways to help solve all of the different issues. But great charities still exist. Great charities is still a great way to help, and great charities bring decades of experience, world-class expertise, and proven track records of accomplishing great things. So we don't want to give up on charity. And what's more, at giving what we can, we think that many donors can more than, or as much as, or more than 100x our impact by giving to the most cost-effective charities according to our values. And for many of us, it might even be more than 100x. That's because there are several things you can do to increase your impact. We're going to write more of an article on this on charity comparisons quite soon. But just to give some examples of the types of things that you can do to massively increase the amount of bang for buck you get from charity. If you're currently giving to charities working on interventions based on a good story like Play Pumps, which aren't backed by evidence, you could 10 or even 100 times your impact by giving to one that is backed by evidence. Or you could direct your income from a wealthy country where your money might be going at the moment to a lower income country where your money might be able to go up to 100 times further. If you're currently giving to a cause based on its proximity to you or a marketing, or you could consider switching to a cause area, which is especially important, tractable, and neglected. And many of these multiply together, meaning you can take a really extraordinary difference. It's like being able to paint a house in a day rather than in several months. But to do this, like a good investor, you need to stop following good marketing and good stories and instead do good analysis. The best way to fix the charitable marketplace is closing that value loop with oversight, specifically having independent evaluators conducting high quality research into how you can maximize your impact. Gather information about charities and the tangible effects they're having via research and direct observation, and then use that to build a full understanding of that charity's impact. Then pass that understanding to donors like us to give as guidance so we actually know what's going on and can make a much more informed decision about where to give. So if you're on board so far, you might still be thinking, where am I going to give? That's not quite enough. Knowing that we need to rely on expert evaluators doesn't quite cut it. So here's a kind of spreadsheet of some of the impact-focused evaluators that we built a few months ago. And there are many evaluators out there. Some provide public charity recommendations. Others manage funds that you can give to where they direct your money to where it's needed most, which is quite an innovative and potentially quite new approach to charitable giving, more like an actively managed fund. Some do this privately by advising individual, often wealthy donors, and some do this publicly. And some do a combination of all of these. So how do we know what to do when we have these evaluators out there? Which one should we choose? They're working in different areas, different methodologies, with somewhat different functions. At Giving What We Can, we think the way we can help is by evaluating the evaluators, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of describing our research project to get at our recommendations this year. So why are we doing this? The first reason is just that we don't have a choice. The Giving What We Can research team is now 3 people, but earlier on in this year, it was just 2 of us. And there's only 2 of us working on charity recommendations. That's just not enough to do charity evaluation of all the charities we want to investigate and all of the important causes that we think we need to work on. So instead, we need to rely on expert evaluators to inform our recommendations. But we want to make sure we're choosing these in a principled way that helps donors and is based on a richer understanding of their work. There are other benefits that we think we can get at by providing these evaluations of evaluators that include potentially improving the quality of the evaluations themselves to create better incentives for the effective giving ecosystem. And for these kinds of reasons, we try to work with evaluators to support them in further improving their methodology, rather than just trying to pick winners and losers. You might next be wondering how we did this. I'll say what we didn't do. What we didn't do was create a really detailed, structured, rigid, comprehensive, academically correct criteria that we applied to every evaluator the same way. We just didn't think that would work. For example, because the nature of charity evaluation varies so much between different cause areas. The kinds of evaluation you can conduct in global health and well-being, where there is a large literature and evidence base to rely on, don't just easily translate into other areas like reducing risks from engineered pandemics. Instead, we aim to use these principles of usefulness, justifiability, and transparency that we first described when we analyzed our own impacts at Giving What We Can. One thing I want to say when I share that we do something like use principles of transparency and justifiability and so on, is that we really did use this. Like, to me, I might get a bit of skepticism about marketing speak or corporate speak, but these were kind of values that we regularly refer to in our discussions about these evaluations. And when we release our reports, you'll be able to see reference to them throughout. So with these principles in mind, the first part of the process was then deciding which evaluators to look into. This was really important because we didn't want to recommend charities based on evaluators that we hadn't actually looked into. There's one sort of exception here, one nuance or shade of gray that I'll highlight later. But in general, that was a really important constraint on our evaluations and a limitation of them too. We then would try to justify what areas of that evaluator we would need to investigate in order to justify a decision on whether to rely on that evaluator. We would then investigate those areas iteratively until we could make a decision. And I use that word iterative by way of saying we often shared the approach with the evaluators as we were going along. So we would say, here's what we're planning on investigating. We'd get feedback from the evaluator about the scope of the investigation, whether maybe we could focus on a different area instead. We also used expert reviewers where we could. So now let's go through what this looked like in practice. So to help decide which evaluators to choose from, we conducted a survey of 16 fundraising organizations who, like us, also need to rely on expert evaluators. So what you're seeing here on the slide is just one of those questions that we asked these fundraising organizations. In this case, the question was, which evaluator are you currently not using that you would use if Giving What We Can's research team came up with a positive evaluation of those recommendations? So in this case, you can see that Happier Lives Institute, or HLI, is a clear outlier, and we saw this as a strong reason to investigate them. Another decision was how many evaluators we would look into at all. From our survey, we found a preference from quality over quantity. So we decided to evaluate a max of 8 and likely fewer charity evaluators. We also reflected ourselves on different features of the evaluator that might make us want to prioritize investigating them. And in all our reports, we share why we chose the evaluators we did. So who did we choose? A big part of this list that we did choose is based on the cause areas, which I want to introduce now. So we evaluated 3 different cause areas: global health and well-being, improving animal welfare, and reducing global catastrophic risks. And within each cause area, we wanted to look into 2 evaluators. What do we mean by a cause area? To us, it's a collection of more specific causes. So for example, within global catastrophic risk, we might be looking at reducing risk from engineered pandemics, or nuclear war, or misaligned artificial intelligence. These are the sub-causes that kind of fit within the scope of that cause area. And they're kind of related to each other in that donors with similar worldviews might want to support each of these causes. Of course, the more granular you get into your worldview, the more you might focus on a particular cause over another. We explained some of the reasoning for why we chose the 3 cause areas we did, but in short, it's based on some global priorities research and also some of the work that we think shows that these are areas where we're likely to expect the most important, to be the most important, tractable, and neglected areas to focus on. So one limitation of the approach is that it's not comprehensive. There are some evaluators and some cause areas that we didn't look into. Also, you can notice that Happier Lives Institute is at the bottom there. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but in the end, we didn't finish the Happier Lives Institute evaluation. We stopped that one short. So we only evaluated the other evaluators. Another thing I should mention from the previous slide is it might have been a bit confusing that EA funds was listed as both within the global catastrophic risk space and the animal welfare space. The reason is because with EA funds, they manage multiple funds across different worldviews, different cause areas. And we looked into their long-term future fund within the GCR space, global catastrophic risk, and the animal welfare fund within the animal welfare space. Next, we might look into Founders Pledge, maybe some of their climate work or work in other cause areas, or Giving Green, or the Happier Lives Institute again, because we think that it's worth resuming that evaluation at a later stage. But it's too soon to tell. We're just wrapping these up now, and so we don't want to make a commitment yet, but we do want to improve the scope of the evaluations we have. So to continue going through, let's give an example of one of the evaluations that we conducted. We'll use GiveWell as an example. And we want to evaluate GiveWell because it's the largest charity evaluator that focuses on cost effectiveness. It also has an outstanding reputation. I'm sure many of you have heard of it before. And we've historically deferred to GiveWell for charity recommendations, and so have a substantial number of our donors and pledges, and their work has informed all of the fundraising organizations we surveyed. So we thought it was important to check. So here's what that kind of looked like. One of the things we checked was their cost effectiveness analyses of a charity recommendation for the Against Malaria Foundation. I first looked at a spreadsheet like this in 2018, back when I was at uni, and my reaction at the time, I think, might be similar to what many of you are feeling, if you're like me, which was to be a bit overwhelmed by the amount of numbers, parameters, inputs. And I just generally took a step back, seemed impressed, and thought, it looks rigorous, I'm happy with it. But for the evaluators project, for the work we've been doing, we didn't want to take that approach. We wanted to make sure everything was correct and that we understood what was going on. And where we didn't, we would note that down and then speak with GiveWell to see if we could find an understanding of where we think something might be going wrong or something that we're confused about. So we, after doing this project, spent a lot of time looking specifically at this cost per life saved estimate. It's just one of the things that we did checks on. And in the end, we thought that it did hold up, that GiveWell was a really even-handed evaluator. We never got this sense that they were juicing the evaluation to promote the cost effectiveness as being greater than it actually is. And in the end, to bring us back to the soccer analogy, we found that their estimate that it's $5,500 to save a life by donating to the Against Malaria Foundation held up as being about as good as an estimate like this can really get. Of course, there's more work that can be done to resolve uncertainty, but we felt confident in standing behind this. And the reason I show you this in this slide is to remind you of why that context of that global income distribution is so important. If it is $5,500 to save a life, then it's quite a lot to think about how little of a deal it is, to how small a fraction of someone's annual income it is to save someone's life if they're in anywhere within that top few people, especially in the income rankings. We did other kinds of investigations into GiveWell's work, including their grant making, overall processes, how they compare different outcomes like improving and saving lives, and their communications and transparency. We share all of this in the report, and if anyone would like more examples of the kinds of quality checks we did or what we checked and why, I can share this in the Q&A. So after all the evaluations, what did we find? What were the takeaways? Which evaluators did we decide to rely on for our recommendations? The big reveal. In the end, we decided to go with relying on GiveWell, Longview Philanthropy, and EA Funds' Animal Welfare Fund and Long-Term Future Fund for Giving What We Can's recommendations. So we do want to say we want to say that we still think that animal charity evaluators and Happier Lives Institute are each of interest to donors interested in maximizing their cost effectiveness, or they're interested in impact. But for different reasons for each, we had reasons to not want to rely on their recommendations. In short, in ACE's case, we didn't think that ACE's current research and evaluation processes were enough for us to rely on, and we'll aim to look at them next year. And as I mentioned, for HLI, we ended up stopping the evaluation short of finishing it because we thought the advantages outweighed the benefits. Essentially, there's a lot more work going on from the HLI research team, and we think it might be better to look at them later on after they've conducted their new research. And added to that, it was going to be really difficult continuing the evaluation because the area that they're providing analysis in is quite contested. There's more to say about that. It's just a bit of a summary of why we discontinued that. Again, happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. So what were our recommendations? In global health and well-being, we are recommending GiveWell's funds and their charity recommendations. In the animal welfare case, we're recommending the EA Animal Welfare Fund. And now I want to mention that kind of shade of gray that I mentioned earlier, which is that we did recommend the Humane League as an alternative to the EA Animal Welfare Fund, because after doing the evaluation, we decided that based on ACE's recommendation, and in addition to that, several other sources of evidence, 3 other pieces of evidence, we thought we could justify a claim that the Humane League was a highly cost-effective organization. This isn't to say that ACE's other charity recommendations couldn't also be extremely cost-effective. It's a hard kind of nuanced thing to communicate here, but we're confident in the Humane League, and I'm happy to get into more detail about this in the Q&A. And in the global catastrophic risk space, we recommend the Long-Termism Fund, which might be rebranded soon, and the Long-Term Future Fund. This is a bit of a sneak peek, but as some of you might know, the Long-Termism Fund was actually launched by Giving What We Can. And so potentially it might come across as a bit strange that we evaluated Longview's work during the grant making for that fund, because we have this conflict. As a result of that conflict, we decided to step down as the managers of the communications for that fund. And now it's fully owned by Longview. So we're really grateful that we managed to get into an arrangement as we were beginning the evaluation to take ourselves out of the fund and lower that conflict of interest. We also are aware of the limitations of our work. And so we want to highlight other supported programs. There are various limitations. I'll go through some now. So we don't cover all evaluators. We also don't cover all promising cause areas in our recommendation, at least yet. So climate change and effective giving meta organizations are some of the ones that we don't currently provide recommendations for, but it's not based on having done research and deciding not to. So we want to make sure that we're making it clear that you can consider these alternatives to our recommendations. We also think that there are many more donation options worth considering for impact-focused donors if they have the time to look at them, and some of which you can look at through our website. We have a whole range of other supported programs. In addition to not covering all evaluators or cause areas, evaluators themselves aren't always comprehensive either. And so there are some charities that are doing great work, but aren't actually investigated by any public, at least public charity evaluators. So given this, we designed our charity recommendations page and other content to link to all the programs we support on our platform. Whew, okay, that's a lot. And I want everyone to take a moment and think about which charity they would like to pick. The kind of title of the talk is which charity you should donate to. So it'd be really good if we could end up with a decision. Okay, I expect for many of you, if you're like many of the donors who come to our website, it's still a little bit, there's still too much choice, and it can be very difficult to make that final decision and pick a single option, which is why we would like to announce our cause area funds. So you're getting a sneak preview into this. This is the first time we've ever announced this. You can choose these cause area funds based on which cause area you find the most compelling. And a nice thing about these funds is that you can make a recurring donation to them, and they will always be updated based on the latest research from the Giving What We Can research team about which evaluators to rely on. So we have 3 different cause area funds, and each will be advised by one of the evaluators we looked into and decided we wanted to rely on their work. So in the global health and well-being case, the fund will be advised by GiveWell, until maybe we look into other evaluators who we might decide to add or add instead or add as well. The Animal Welfare Advocacy Fund will grant, is likely to grant based on the advice of the EA Animal Welfare Fund, and also potentially to the Humane League as well. And the Risks and Resilience Fund will be advised by the Long-Term Future Fund and by Longview. Now, there aren't any other funds like this, and we're really excited to be able to launch them because we needed, we got a common request from many of our donors who are giving through our platform that they needed a default. But we felt previously that we couldn't justify that without having done research into which evaluator we wanted to advise these default funds. Also, you might have noticed down at the bottom that we have an all cause funds bundle that you can give to if you'd like to give to a range of these cause areas as well. And you can choose the amount you'd like to allocate to each. So to wrap things up, which charity should you donate to? It depends a lot on the values you have and the time you have available. If you like a simple solution, then we recommend the cause area funds. If you'd like to do a little bit more digging and do a bit more research yourself onto which you believe you can which fund or charity you can give to maximize your donations given your values, you can use our recommendations. If you want to do more digging, then you can look for something else in all of the supported programs we recommend, which include climate change organizations, other organizations like charity entrepreneurship or charities working in the animal welfare space. And you can also give outside of Giving What We Can, and we provide resources for all of that as well. So our website will be updated with all of these by the 27th. As mentioned, this is more a sneak preview of what's to come. And that aside, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing any questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that wonderful presentation. I see we've had a number of questions submitted already, so let's start with the first one. By Wes R. What does GiveWell or you at Giving What We Can consider a life saved in disability adjusted life years or quality adjusted life years?
That's a great question. So we did look into how GiveWell look into the life saved estimate. We didn't look so much into that side of it. That was an area where I would have to review our report and review the research further. So I don't want to give an answer for now. I think that GiveWell's website probably can provide guidance there. My understanding is that they have a kind of, actually, I don't want to speculate where it's outside of an area of my expertise for now. So, but I would strongly recommend checking GiveWell's website out and then checking the report where we discuss the cost per life save estimate and some of the digging we did there.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is by Rowan Smith. How can charity evaluators better account for potential political impact of charity activity? Randomized control trials often cannot predict this, but it is crucial to consider.
That's a really interesting question. So one approach to charity evaluation is to use what's called randomized controlled trials, where you're trying to find the kind of interventions that are doing the best work according to this type of evidence, which is really rigorous, but it's also constrained. You can't do a randomized controlled trial on whether, say, giving to a particular political campaign is going to be more or less successful. And sometimes in policy areas, you can't do that either. So for one thing, I think we do want to highlight this. In the GiveWell report, for example, we provided in the appendix quite a lengthy discussion about potential areas that are not at least within GiveWell's current focus that we think that they might want to consider providing more reasoning as to why they're not focusing in that area. And that was specifically around policy that could promote economic growth. But then some of the other evaluators we look into, especially in reducing global catastrophic risk, do end up supporting that kind of political work and systemic change. So there, often what we do at Giving What We Can is rely on this distinction between an evidence-based approach and a hits-based approach. So an evidence-based approach is where you kind of look at the past of a charity's track record and then extrapolate that into the future. A hits-based approach is a bit different. It's where you kind of take the position of a venture capitalist, where you are looking at a selection of potential options and then trying to use as much expert information as you can about the theories of change of each of these options and back many of them, expecting most to fail, but then some to get really big wins. And I think open philanthropy has some really good work on why you might think that hits-based evaluation or hits-based giving is a really promising approach. And that's the approach that, for example, the Long-Term Future Fund takes, and to an extent, the long view take with their grant making.
Great. Thank you for that. The next question is by Emma6. Is the evaluators report publicly accessible?
The evaluator reports will all be publicly accessible on at least by the 27th. We're really going to push to get them out next week if we can, but by the 27th, they'll all be public. And we're really looking forward to community feedback on those as well.
Okay. XB Low has a question, but she didn't really mention about the context. Her question is, what about open phil and why not?
What about open phil and why not? So Open Philanthropy are we're an organization in that list of evaluators and grant making organizations that I had in one of the previous slides. They, for example, take this hits-based approach that I mentioned before. They don't provide public charity recommendations, and they don't manage any public funds, at least to my knowledge. So it's not really an option for donors to contribute to Open Philanthropy's work. That said, we did have several people at Open Philanthropy work with us as several people. We had at least one person, just one person, I think, or maybe two, work with us as an advisor to our reports and providing reviews and comments, because they are doing a lot of work in the similar space and there is a lot of overlap of aims. I should also flag that Open Philanthropy are one of Giving What We Can's major funders.
Okay. We'll move on to the next question by Bridget. Were there any lessons learned about the aspects of high quality evaluation? Any surprising features of good quality evaluators?
That's something that we would love to reflect more on in the coming month, to really reflect on what we learned from this process and what best practices were and potentially sharing those. Was there anything surprising? I think that I think personally, one reflection I have is that I was very impressed by GiveWell's work and how comprehensive it was in terms of really using all the evidence available as best as possible and aggregating it through these kind of thoughtful processes. For example, by considering a wide number of potential funding opportunities and then narrowing it down at each stage, looking for doing further and further investigation so that they could start with a large pool and then at each stage kind of filtering down to only the most effective options available to get at those really top few options which they recommend. I would also say that some of the approach in a very different area by Longview, seemed like really good best practices around that kind of hits-based giving. They kind of, in some ways, we thought within that hits-based giving approach had some processes that really made us feel confident in their recommendations or in their grants. So, for example, they often considered the downsides of grants and the people involved in them. So they were really interested in making sure that they weren't providing, say, a grant to an organization that would in the end do harm. And all of this is in the report, but I think I would focus on those two as an example of where I kind of got some sense of what best practice might look like.
Okay, thank you for sharing. We have another question. Would you ever consider evaluating UNICEF, International Red Cross, etc., who internally prioritize programs? They are unlikely to be recommended, but it would be incredibly useful to quantify times 100 effect statements.
This is a really great question. So it's funny, I was preparing this talk and my mom asked me that exact question, and I really found it difficult to give an answer to it. So even though I'm prepared for it, it's a good one. I think I would love if we could do an evaluation of an organization like UNICEF or one of those more mainstream charitable giving, those mainstream charities that people think of when they think about charitable giving. The answer I gave earlier today was that often our approach is to really look for what's neglected. So we kind of ask the question, where are people not looking, rather than where are other people donating? And but to be fair, I don't have much familiarity with those organizations' work and structure, so I couldn't speak to their kind of cost effectiveness directly. But I think it would be a really good thing to do, and I think that there would be a lot of lessons to learn from that, and potential good lessons and also communications updates. I think we've had a dropout of, at least on my end, I can't see. The host, in which case I think I have another slide that I can just use in the meantime. So the beginning of that talk began with this introduction through the soccer field and went through the kind of idea of this marketplace and the closed value loop. That was all material that I want to give credit to Alex Savard, my colleague, director of design, for. He is available to give workplace talks. It's kind of adapted. A lot of this talk has been adapted from his work there. And so if any of you would like to potentially have a talk like that given at your workplace, then I would strongly recommend looking up workplace giving talks on Giving What We Can's website, or just searching it into Google and then reaching out to us or me by Swapcard. Oh, welcome back.
Hi, I'm sorry, my screen blacked out.
All good.
I'm not sure where you ended, but I'll just continue with the next question. Is that all right? Okay. What is the relative value? What is the relative value of disaster relief donations compared to the charity recommendations? Are there rules of thumb to determine the marginal value of $1 based on the disaster?
So charitable giving disasters are a really good example of where people often feel very compelled to provide support. They see a disaster, they really want to take action. Again, we sort of are Giving What We Can think a lot more on the margin of where you can provide the most dollar, given what's happening in the world. And we have an article on our website about why we tend to not recommend disaster relief, and I would recommend people have a look at that. But again, it's coming back to that idea I mentioned previously of rather than asking sort of where is everyone else giving, we're kind of looking for the blind spots. What's kind of happening that isn't getting attention and funding? What's neglected? What's something that's occurring, like for example, malaria every day, but doesn't provide as much of a feature in the headlines, and maybe isn't getting as much attention as it needs to.
We have another question from Amir Virani. A lot of people in the global north seem to donate to cancer research. Do you know anything about the cost effectiveness of the major donation recipients?
Another area we haven't looked into. So cancer research is a really common donation for people to make, or at least that's my understanding as well. And again, this is sort of, in some sense, these questions about other charities that and sort of specific areas, and sort of my difficulty in finding and being able to answer every case kind of reveals why we think that we need to have kind of expert evaluators really looking into providing the best guidance of where you can give within a particular area. So I'd say our approach, I would say it's sort of almost by our approach, that kind of work might not do so well on this neglectedness criteria that we have in terms of the cause areas that we're looking to, that we use to decide which evaluator to look into. But I think it could be interesting to look at the cost effectiveness of that. I expect that that's the kind of work that might also be supported by government actors and major foundations that already exist.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Wes R. Do you feel more confident in the Humane League or the EA Fund?
Good question. Do we feel more confident in the Humane League or the EA Fund? So the Humane League provide work. We're specifically restricting the donations or grants to the Humane League to their work supporting corporate campaigns, which is the majority of the work they do, to improve the conditions of animals in factory farms. And is that more cost effective than the EA Animal Welfare Fund, which in some cases can provide grants to organizations doing those corporate campaigns? So there's some overlap of their work, but they also support other areas from wild animal suffering to work promoting the movement of animal welfare activism and advocacy. Which is more cost effective ended up being something that we didn't think we could provide a good assessment of. And as a result of that, we're currently intending to, our current plans are to grant to each of them equally from our animal welfare cause area fund. As a result, it would be really interesting to see what a kind of analysis of the EA Animal Welfare Fund's cost effectiveness is, because there are some of these analyses for the Humane League, which is generally what informed our recommendation of it. But as is, it just ended up being a question where we just couldn't justify a view on that, and so didn't come down with one. I think different donors can look at the case for each and then make their own decisions based on their worldview.
Our next question is by Wes R again. What other evaluators are there that you know of?
I think it's probably accurate to say that this project of looking into and investigating charitable giving experts to see which one to rely on is a relatively new one, at least for the sake of public giving. So there are other fundraising organizations that exist, and in some cases have a researcher on their team. But generally speaking, I think that this is the first of its kind. There are definitely ad hoc kind of occasional evaluations, for example, into say GiveWell's work. They ran a contest for this, but that was generally not a sort of broad sweep of doing quality checks across a range of evaluators. So I would say that there's definitely work critiquing and providing constructive feedback for each individual evaluator, but I'm not aware of another project which really looked at them across the board in these kind of cause areas.
We have a next question by Ima6. Are these cause area funds not duplicates of the EA funds or the cause area funds of the country-specific effective giving organizations?
That's a good question. So what is the exact scope of those cause area funds? They're not quite duplicates. Well, they're not duplicates of the EA funds in that, for example, if you give to the Effective Animal Advocacy Fund, that will be advised by the EA Fund's Animal Welfare Fund, but also it could grant to the Humane League. So it might end up doing both. And ultimately, if there's another charity evaluator in the animal welfare space that we think is providing really good work, we'll switch to having it advise the fund if we think that would lead to a greater cost effectiveness of the fund's giving. So it's not the same. I think it's the first of its kind. Really what it is just a way of giving based on this work we did evaluating different evaluators. It's still advised by those grant makers, so there is some overlap. So for example, one One case is, in all likelihood, we expect the Global Health and Wellbeing Fund, the cause area fund that we're launching, to in effect be used to make very similar grants or have the same scope as GiveWell's All Grants Fund. So in that, but the difference is if you set a recurring donation to the Global Health and Wellbeing Fund, and then in the end we decide to onboard or ask another evaluator, such as Happier Lives Institute, to advise the fund, then the fund will end up being different. So it's an option with some similarities and some overlap, but really what it is just a kind of tool to help people give in a really simple way and know that it's being guided by expert evaluators.
Okay, great. I think we have to wrap the session now as we are reaching the time. Michael, would you like to share some last few words before you end the session?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all being here. And I would really encourage you to check out Giving What We Can's website and recommendations page as you're thinking about your giving this giving season. So I would recommend checking it on the 27th of November or by the end of the month. And then another quick thing would be, you might have noticed that I have this pledge, this pin, and this represents the Giving What We Can pledge of a pledge to give 10% of my income, in my case, to charity over my lifetime. And I think it's a really important part of our mission to kind of have this idea of giving significantly and effectively. And so for anyone who's considering taking the pledge or has been for a while, then I would strongly suggest considering doing so or looking into the trial pledge potentially. But yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Michael. And if any of you would like to speak to Michael, he will be having his office hours later in the next, just in a few minutes time. So yeah, that concludes the session for this talk. Goodbye and have a great day ahead, everyone.